Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's History Room Live. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I am the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian here in the Sagadahoc History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library. History Room Live is a monthly program, and we do our best to bring you monthly speakers, primary sources, and hopefully soon workshops that aim to highlight the history of Maine and our communities. For those of you on Zoom, welcome. Please note that this is a Zoom webinar, so you won't be able to turn on your camera or unmute, but you're welcome to type any questions into the Q&A or chat. The chat should be enabled now. And I will be monitoring Zoom on another laptop for any issues that arise and to help moderate the Q&A after the presentation. Today, I am so pleased to welcome Captain Eric Wiberg to the Patent Free Library. Eric Wiberg is the author of over 20 books on maritime history, particularly in the Bahamas where he was raised. His latest book, U-Boats in New England, is the culmination of 10 years of work and the third and last in his U-Boat trilogy. U-Boats in New England earned Best Book of the Week from the New York Post, and it was also featured in Vanity Fair. In addition to writing and researching, Eric is a licensed 100-ton ship captain, maritime lawyer, and all-around world adventurer. He is on the New York Yacht Club Library Committee and Steamship Historical Society Board. Currently, he lives and works as a captain in Boston with his son. We are so pleased to have him here today to discuss U-Boats in New England. After the presentation, Eric will be doing a Q&A, and for those of you on Zoom, I'll ask your questions to Eric from the chat, and he will also be selling an array of his books. So please join me in welcoming Eric Wiberg.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate. Well, we're without a mic, and I'm really excited to share this presentation with you, particularly since we're in the heart of New England and one of the greatest shipbuilding districts of the world, particularly here in Bath. So it seems really relevant, and I feel I have a really informed audience. And thank you so much for inviting me to the Patent Free Library. I came here on research, and I'm really thrilled to be back. If I were to admit to two aspects of the research, rather that's upside down. So this is a map, and while you study it, it's a chart of all the vessels which sank off the New England coast. And during World War II, basically 42 to 45. So pretty much the first weeks of the war, all the way to the last days of the war, and even after the war, there was a lot of activity with boats surrendering. There was one last slingshot. It all began with the Germans slingshotting a ton of U-boats. Like they would have sent 30 or 40, but they held a couple in reserve to protect against the British fighting in Norway, invading Norway, and also the Med. They didn't want to lose the access to the Gibraltar, so Hitler insisted that half the U-boats remain in Europe. But the idea was completely overwhelm the U.S. coast, and they did. They killed 5,000 Allied sailors in U.S. waters. U.S. territory, 5,000 mariners, and that's twice as number killed in Pearl Harbor, and also 30% more than that. Why don't we know? I say largely because two reasons. The information is classified and kept from the public until the 70s. And second of all, to be frank, a lot of the Allied mariners weren't like American. Chinese, British, or Irish, South Africa, wherever they weren't, U.S. citizens. And so I think it had less of an impact. But they were our allies, and they were something in our waters due to our failure to protect. We had given away all our destroyers to the British, a lot of the good ones, including the four stackers from the First World War, and we just didn't have the equipment for a two-front war. And FDR was repeatedly reelected because he wouldn't go to war. So you can't give away half your fleet, appease everyone by not building ships, and then fight both in Japan and in the Atlantic and win. And we couldn't. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what happened. And the people who paid the price were those who were trying to basically get to and from Halifax. This map is made by Robert Eller Pratt. He does an amazing job with maps. I'm very grateful to him. And on the left are the three scenes of the trilogy. And there they are. New England, which goes to the Bermuda, and then Bahamas, where I grew up, was the first. They had 130 ships. Bermuda had, I think, about 75 ships sunk, and New England had about 35 ships, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the coast isn't that far. You know, it's from this Cape Sable to Montauk is only about 350 miles. So we did lose a ship for every 10 miles and for every month of the time we were fighting. So when you look at it from that perspective, here are the statistics. May not be visually appealing, but I think it's very important to pause and digest. Oh, can't see me. Oh, of course. Yep. Thank you for letting me know. I'm going to be a little more stationary, which allows me to see the material. Thank you, Zoom, for letting us know that. So these are all the basic the data points that we cover. When it comes, some people are interested in the strategy behind why the book came to be. For me, it was obviously the third in a trilogy, and I was tired of writing about regions that nobody lived in. Bermuda has like 30,000 people, as important as they are. Bahamas has about 230,000, and people weren't, it wasn't generating a lot of buzz. So I thought, well, if I cover New England, New England's main, one of the main themes is the landing of saboteurs. For Bermuda, it was obviously like the rescue of people by airplane. And in Bahamas, it was just the sheer volumes of ships sunk outside the water and what happened to them, and the key trade routes. With New England, the trade route obviously is the trunk that connects Halifax. As you'll see from the photos and so forth, I think we've covered this. There is an emphasis, and this is like how messy it got. These green lines, and I know there's some imperfections at the top, and no need to focus on it. This is my data points, you know, to feed into. Before I write a sentence, I have to have hundreds of pages of data that's pure and it's clean and it's tested. Some filmmakers and others talk about like urban legends and oral history about what they saw a submarine attacking. You know, I don't go for that. I want to know what's the lat long of every U-boat every day, and I get the log book in English of every U-boat a day. And believe me, that takes a long time. So I know what all the players were doing before I start. In Boston, for example, they had, I love this, in Nahant and in South Quincy, they strung an electric wire between the ports, and they strung one on the surface and under the water, so they would check you as you would filter in and out of the different areas. So you knew every US vessel, the Genevieve, for example, you knew the name, and you could find the commander and of all these vessels. So you really knew what both sides were up to. Without being biased, I try to tell both sides of the story. I was taught that by Michael Gannon, who wrote Operation Drumbeat, and I try to tell a story that hasn't been told. Everyone's talked about Hatteras. It's ad nauseum. It's like 8 books about the U-boat attacks off Hatteras. But I tried to write something different. I tried to show both perspectives. Reinhard Hardagen was alive until a couple of years ago. You know, I never interviewed him. I interviewed another U-boat commander. But the fact that he lived until a few years ago and over 60% of them died in combat is extraordinary. He was a sorry? Nope. Oh yeah, he was a Luftwaffe officer that got injured. And so he kind of went to the U-boat arm. Another thing about the U-boats is these guys, they weren't known for their political fanaticism. And in no way am I making excuses for them. But one of them was punished because he didn't put political officers on the walls. And the U-boat environment, like today's talking away, is a little less formal. This isn't a battleship. This isn't, you know, a Panzer division. These guys are living and sweating in extremely tight confines. And American mariners and those who serve, thank you, like can't maybe even realize how horrible it was on a submarine. Like nobody lived on a German submarine when it got to port. They had 2 toilets. One of them was filled with food and water to last across the Atlantic and back. They had of the fuel tanks and not in nuclear engineer fuel tanks. They would put water in some of the fuel tanks. Fuel in the water tanks. I'm not an expert in engineering, but they would go ahead slow on one diesel and ahead slow on the other diesel and electric in order to go double the range. You know, so on paper these vessels were not capable, and this is more relevant in the Caribbean. But on paper they weren't capable of going to the Caribbean for a month. But in reality, between men doubling in a bunk so they could fill it with food and filling torpedoes tubes with food and using just one toilet, we were able to do it, but it stank to high heaven. and they were often on the bottom waiting because they were attacked during the day off the East Coast a lot later in the war. And so it was just a miserable environment. Just, you can imagine the smells starting, vomit, food, diesel, the chlorine gas would build. So every 8 to 12 hours, you had to go up or you would die. And the men would start to become lethargic. Now, what's interesting is New England's nexus, as they say, with the greater world. Like they were sending Luftwaffe and Messerschmitt plans to Japan as Germany was dying at the hands of the Axis. They were smuggling their plans on how to build factories. The Messerschmitt factory guru was going to Japan, and he was caught in New England. Iridium, uranium, there's rumors of gold and all that stuff. And not many of them actually used mercury, but there were some really significant things. You'll see later a fellow named Steinhoff, whose brother was kidnapped as Operation Paperclip to build the atomic bomb. He was captured in New England and subsequently killed himself. I only throw this in. I thought of giving a presentation on U-boats in New England. Every few slides, you're going to see this kind of data just to give you an idea of the extent of it. For one of the ships was sunk because the captain's father was a lobsterman, and the Cornwallis was sunk off Mount Desert. It was going up to Yarmouth, I think, in Canada, inside Bay of Fundy, and he wanted to keep the lights on so he wouldn't hit a lobster boat. So he kept the lights on so that his father and those guys wouldn't get run over. And the Germans saw the lights and just he was probably going to kill him anyway, but just made the job a lot easier. And only 4 men survived that. So, and there was an amazing story of that survival while we're on that topic. One of them, the Canadian Navy, pulled this poor English fellow like out of the water. And this like 19-year-old kid had been given a flying jacket, like a bomber jacket, a leather one with the fancy writing that they were supposed to live off with supplies and money sewn in. And so the British guy was so grateful, he gave the Canadian rescuer, because your survivability, as you know, in New England is not high in the winter or even the summer. And so he gave the bomber jacket. True story. The bomber jacket, how did it go? The bomber jacket is still preserved. Like, you know, it's still preserved by that family 4 generations. It was recently passed on to a 20-year-old by the grandfather. But the story got even better. It was the guy who got rescued was in Australia driving a cab, and the other fellow was in Australia visiting his son, and they met. And so they were like, oh wait, it's just a really small world story that the internet definitely helps make those stories. I'm trying to think of which one of these boats. These are, as you can see, almost all of them are British. Scotland was Norwegian. Lumber, so it tells you a lot. Sugar, that would be coming, okay, it's from New York to Montreal. Almost all of them were going, to, I'm gonna skip now. And this tells you how many died. So 35 were rescued and taken to Portland. So that's germane, obviously, to Maine. Halifax, St. John. So just a lot of, this is the data. This creates so what is a U-boat? A U-boat is an untersea boat, but unlike today's U-boats, it has to constantly, like a turtle, pop up and get air. And that's its biggest weakness. I'll cut to the end of the story in a way, but the Americans finally mastered killing these machines, not by waiting off Boston and going zigzagging until they found it, because the Germans generally outsmarted them, but they waited in the middle of the Atlantic because they knew it had come up for air. So they would just set an aircraft carrier group surrounded by many support vessels, and they would just wait for the German to pop up for air. And as soon as they did, the first one would try to airborne sink it, and the second, and they never let up. They just followed until the thing was sunk. And we know this also because Germans, some of them did survive, and we could fix which one was which. But that was how we solved the U-boat problem, by capitalizing on their weakness. This is one of the very first ships sunk by the Reinhard Hardegen. There was a rumor, and one of the things I just can't abide is sort of unsubstantiated rumor, that this Hardegen had gone into New York and sunk ships. For 2 things. Reinhard Hardegen had gone into New York before the war as a cadet, and he was very proud of that, and as a guest of America. But also, he never went to New York Harbor. He didn't have to. He shut the harbor down. The ships didn't come out because he was waiting outside. And what happened, this Goebbels, this horrible man who was the propagandist, he was ticked off, right? Because he had put a propagandist, which helped make the film Das Boot, put the propagandist on the sub to make a big story. And the propagandist came back and said, Goebbels said, well, what kind of footage did you get of attacking New York? He said, well, you see, we didn't get into New York because there's no reason to, and it was too dangerous. And so he fictionalized a photo. So it's not everyone's fault. There was a fictionalized photo of the sub with the telescope in New York Harbor. So even though the sub didn't go into New York Harbor, there was a photo saying it had. So that's how you get confusion. By the way, a German commander told me they didn't go to movies and all this stuff and all the receipts on the bread and all. And they didn't have to. They rifled through. They were curious kids. They had girlfriends at home. They rifled through people's belongings. They rifled through ships that had been abandoned. They rifled through lifeboats, sometimes finding abandoned lifeboats, sometimes, sadly, with bodies in it. So it's worth knowing, reading every word of a German Kriegstagebuch, day book, because it can tell you what happened to your ancestors. If their lifeboat, the Pauline, for example, in Canada, was found months later, very sad stuff. There's a lot of sad stuff. But anyway, and these are about people. And of course, the politics are abhorrent. And of course, all of that. But at the end of the day, these are people that manned a submarine and overwhelmingly were killed. This is an engineer. This I find interesting. This is an illegal diary of photos kept by a sailor. That one you can see in a face like that in Brooklyn. But Tot was the big Autobahn construction company. They built the bunkers in which the U-boats were sheltered 30, 40 feet deep, right? Reinforced concrete. If the RAF and others had managed to bomb those during construction, the U-boats would not have had this base so close to America, but they didn't. And Tot, which was the Autobahn maker, organization Tot, were hired by Hitler to build these bunkers in France, and they succeeded. So they were engineers. So it's just interesting. This guy's name is Tot. And I'm pretty sure that's a Breton. I don't know if anyone's an expert, but a Brittany, France hat. That's not a German hat. That he's in France, in front of the bunkers. So people say, oh, loose lips sink ships. A drunk guy in the lower battery in New York is not going to ruin America's naval plans. Why? Because the Germans didn't have any radar. They had a little bit of sonar. They had a couple scared teenagers with binoculars who were out in the elements with their eyes sore and their hands sore and freezing. And this is how they found our ships. Sitting on a conning tower, if you'll note, back to back, one either side, starboard port, and this one on the front. And that's what they do. And that's how they found the ships. And they were very discriminatory. They would say, oh, well, that's Swedish, that's Spanish, that's, whatever, Portuguese. Here, this fellow is going down. So this is also very interesting. Who was on our side? Because obviously, if it weren't for the Panama neutrality zone, we would have been attacked sooner. But these guys sort of were the first on the battlefield because they were prep school and Ivy League volunteers that didn't want to fire guns. They wanted to be editors of newspapers and tank truck fixers and mechanics or anything you want, mailroom clerks. And these are all very wealthy families from New England prep schools. Each one of these, I guarantee, went to like Fay, St. George's, Phillips Exeter, Princeton, Andover, the Bow School of Arts. I mean, wealthy, privileged people, and they volunteered for this organization, the name of which I forget, but it was basically, American Field Service. And why do I know that? All the gentlemen and women that volunteered for the AFS have an exceptionally good archivist, thank you, Margaret Kay, who kept records of the photos of their data. They had a dorm parent that would be waiting on shore for when they got sunk to reassign them to another ship. Then they would travel from New York to Boston to Providence to, because they were always getting sunk. And they were also, I love this, they were good sailors because they went to prep school. They sailed on teams. And so when these rusty, crusty British and Indian captains would end up in the ocean with a little boat to navigate, they called on the prep school kids to help them navigate the boats because the prep school kids knew how to sail a darn boat. And the masters of these huge ships had lost some of that edge. So on the bottom, you see USS Eagle. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that sinking, but it was the last week of the war. The submarines were told to surrender. And this one either heard the message and ignored it, which is the most likely scenario and was suicidal, or he just didn't hear it, didn't care. But it was sunk on the 23rd of April. So the order to surrender had not been sent. And it was von Warendorf. And he went on to sink the Black Point on the 5th of May, well after the surrender. And he was sunk by who? A Harvard-educated sculptor on a destroyer who retired to Maine. You can look him up. The name escapes me at the moment, but this is true stuff. I mean, you really can't make it up. And then this makes me cry, especially as a merchant mariner. This is just some of the stuff that U-boats find in the middle of the ocean. They were sinking so many ships. They sank over 4,000 ships, I think. They were sinking so many ships that like boilers would pop up and lifeboats would pop up and barrels of food would start. Not so much bodies and stuff, but like they would come across the most astounding stuff. And you'll see later that somebody who was sunk on one ship, they could be attacked by 4 submarines and go to 3 different ships before they make it to shore. And when they do make it to shore, the US investigators say they're absolutely worthless as a source of intelligence. Their PTSD was so bad, they were just mumbling, jumbling, jabbering. They couldn't make any sense. They had no idea which U-boat sank, which ship, or what. It was just really quite sad. But this guy is the last picture of him alive. I hope his wife never sees it. She probably made him the scarf. They came across a boat that had been sunk a few weeks later, a week before, and he's begging him, just give one of us. He's got like 18 men. He's like, just take one of us. And this guy's saying, you're out of luck, bud. Get the hell off my boat. I mean, look at his face. This is the U-boat commander. And he was put in the boat and was never seen ever again. It's really sad. And there's a lot of pathos. These aren't just like data and statistics. I mean, it really is very, especially those who have worked on the North Atlantic and can relate. It's just such a harsh environment. Enough. And then you add war to it. And it's just like, you know, exponentially. So this really lays out the New England case very simply and very clearly. Boston being the largest naval base in the area, almost all roads led to Boston. So you had 268. There were about 1,500 people that were sunk in New England. About 570, it's over here somewhere, were landed in New England. And then about 450 died of that, which is about right. Normally about a quarter of the crew were killed, and they were normally killed 2 ways. Either they were blown up by the initial explosion and went down the ship, possibly left behind on the ship, was left less often, but if the ship had oil, they're obviously very low survivability. But last of all, you typically have 3 boats, and 3 would enter a storm, and one of them, for whatever reason, technical failure, bad leadership, whatever the reason, 2 would sail out of that storm. So normally a whole lifeboat would just go. But then the U-boats would report which lifeboat they found, and you could triangulate which ship lost which boat. So it was you can know almost everything that happened. For example, the Germans would give rum, and the rum would be saved for the intelligence community, and it would say Funk has gotten 5 Hamburg, so you'd know where the rum came from. And you know, so the cigarettes, all this stuff. But basically, why does this relate to Maine? On the bottom, you see Portland, the West Immoden, 35 men, which is a lot, landed on the day after Hitler's birthday, 4/21/42. That's my dad's birthday. His mom refused to let him be born on his birthday. USS Eagle, so that was right here, very nearby in Portland, 13 men, and the new Nantucket lightship, which is not known for its versatility, managed to maneuver and save about 5 of those men. Very low survivability. That boat was junk. Ford mass-produced, he was going to make 100 of them, and by the 20th, they were like, it's cranky, it's slow, it's more like a car or a truck than a ship. It was extremely inflexible, rigid, and the men hated working on them, and you know, so on and so on and so on. But the Navy felt strongly enough. Apparently, the admiral whose job it was to patrol America in the last months of the war had screwed up in Portland. And he was supposed to have had planes airborne and ships protecting against a U-boat attack. He didn't. They failed. A U.S. military ship was sunk within a mile or 2 of Portland Owlhead Light. And to cover up the loss, the Navy said there was a boiler explosion, notwithstanding that the boilers had been serviced about 2 months before. So, and had never been an issue. So it was clear it was a submarine, and the few survivors witnessed a submarine, and they named the von Werendorf's conning tower pattern. Everyone had their bragging rights. And we know because von Werendorf's submarine was sunk off Newport by the sculptor from Camden. So you can look at the tower and look at the illustrations of the sub and know darn well that it was sunk. Of course, the fact the submarine was sunk did make it more difficult because it didn't file a report when it got home. So General Greene, Nantucket was very busy. Angeles, I have to, wow, okay. Angeles, we have to, we're going to get to the Angeles when it comes to a photo. Mattocket, so New Bedford. I like the one that there was one that was driven to Brighton, Massachusetts. I think 3, and they were really ill, so they were driven from Newport. So Brighton, of course, is landlocked. So you wonder how, how did they Mount Desert Rock? That was a sad one because They weren't clear. The Navy wasn't clear. Are you in Mount Desert? And isn't there another one like Rockland? And anyway, there's Mount Desert and then Desert Island. Anyway, there was a big confusion. Mount Desert Rock, Mount Desert Island, and that cost lives. I don't. Given the time remaining, suffice to say on these ships that this is the one where the young men were incapable of speaking. I really want to get, so they went from all these different ships, like 4 different ships. And by the end of and these are the boats that rescued them. By the end of it, a Norwegian guy was so fed up because he would have someone row up to his ship, and the British guy had the Norwegian captain row up the ship. And he's like, okay, I'll come aboard, hurry up. I don't want to get sunk. Yeah, where are you going? Cape Town. Nah, I don't want to go with you to Cape Town because you're going to get sunk. And I have 30 men, and you don't have enough food for 30 men. You've already got survivors from other ships. You don't have enough food, you don't have water, and I'm not going to spend 30 days waiting to get sunk again. I'd rather get in my rowboat, take your water and cigarettes, and get the heck out of here and row to Cape Cod, Nauset, Massachusetts. A number of them washed up in Nauset. And so finally, the Norwegian, the English captain's like, why should I go to Cape Town when everyone's getting sunk? I'm going to Boston. I'm going to seek shelter because these ships didn't have convoys. They weren't protected. And this is some of the boys, Chinese crew, you've got little boys in there somewhere in those pictures, and Chinese as well. And that's where they stayed. This is in Boston. This is the only photo in 3 books, a trilogy of a woman. I believe that it's a woman. I think you'll agree. She has a beret. She's a journalist, and that's at the Boston Fish Pier. So it's very rare. But the Coast Guard saw this as a teaching moment about those damn Nazis are going to blow up all your fishing boats. So the Coast Guard desperately and the Navy desperately wanted to recruit fishermen to report on the Germans. Well, the flaw in that plan is when you radio in, I see a German U-boat at Lat Long, the German's watching you and listening, and he doesn't like it. So then they tried the carrier pigeon, and the Germans didn't speak pigeon, I like to say. So they tie a carrier. But a fisherman who's like trying to set nets and like write messages in code often gets it wrong. So they bombed the heck out of West Tisbury, New Martha's Vineyard, because the guy who gave the wrong Lat Long, and the Navy's like, there's a sub here, so a lot of miscommunication. I'm going to skip to the good parts. You may have heard of Amagansett, Long Island, and the landing of saboteurs there. This was John Dash, who led the whole operation. It was led by Admiral Canaris, and Canaris was the head of the Abwehr, which is the foreign intelligence, basically espionage. And they had this guy Sorkinski, I think, who landed on Mussolini's mountain and rescued him. So these are like bad guys, except the Canaris was of the old guard, the Prussians, and he hated Hitler. And for Canaris, the more drunk, compromised in any way, gambling addicts, sexual addicts, whatever, he dumped them in America, knowing they would fail. And they all failed. Most of them surrendered. One of them was known as Mr. $50 Bill. He named the mission after his wife. The Canadians released him after back to his wife because of his behavior hadn't really broken any Canadian laws. He buried half his $1 million money under a pile of snow and was surprised in a park, was surprised when it had been taken. So he's not too bright. Then you had, this is a guy who's a loner, which a lot of spies were. He worked in Spain. He landed in Maine. Yep. Oh no, this one was in Canada. Yeah, this is the one, the $50 bill. The one on the left is Bill Colpaw. This is a very interesting story because this is a Maine story. Colpaw, by the way, the story of Amagansett has 2 relevant portions. One, that the submarine grounded on a sandbank and wasn't able to get free. It could have been the biggest intelligence coup for the US Navy. This was right outside New York in June of 42, early in the war, long before 505. However, the commander panicked and managed to, first of all, when he started grounding on the bank, he flooded the tanks so he wouldn't go further up on the sand, which is very smart. It takes a lot of counterintuitive intelligence. Then when water was coming back before the sun rose, he put, I'm not an engineer, but he put all the engine RPM onto one shaft and went, and they had the syphilis guy wrapped in life rafts to drop him over so he would live because he was dying anyway. And then they made it. They backed off and he buried it at the bottom of the Atlantic and didn't let anyone work for 12 hours. So that was a really weird story that most of the world didn't know. The men escaped. They were seen by a young lady, Louise Temple. It said, Daddy, I just saw a guy in a Nazi swimsuit waving to me on the beach at 10 o'clock at night. And he goes, there, girl. Every girl says that. Like, another girl fantasy, but she was right. And if they'd stopped him, they would have stopped the terror cell. But he turned himself in. The ones that weren't killed, one was too young and dumb. The other was the one who turned them all in. They were spared. They went to Germany. The ones that lived were shot in DC, and they're buried like under an underpass outside DC, and nobody knows where. And that's the way it should be. They are intentionally unfindable. But here is the main. This is the main story. This is so amazing. And how much time do I have? Okay, so I have about 10 minutes. This is truly an amazing story about New England. Bill Cobalt, Niantic, Connecticut, German grandmother. They are the caretakers of a wealthy summer resort right near Fisher's Island. He feels maligned that the rich people, these American rich people, aren't nice enough to him. And he's cleaning their toilets and, queuing up their golf clubs or whatever. And he grows to resent Americans, right? And his grandmother, meanwhile, is fueling it all. These rich Americans, things are better in the old country. We used to win wars. We used to invade France. The German, the land of Goethe and Bach or whatever. So he buys into this stuff, right? He's mentally unstable anyway. So he buys into it. He joins a military academy, gets kicked out for the good of the service. That can't be good. And so he tried to join everything to fit in. He tried like the Coast Guard cadets, and he got kicked out of everything. Tried merchant marine, then he jumped on a merchant ship and went to South America, came back to Boston, and then he started listening to German propaganda on the Boston waterfront during the war. As the upshot of which the U.S. consulate is now watching him because he's now going rogue. So he goes, I think, on a Swedish ship to Lisbon, and true to Canaris, the admiral, he presents himself to the German embassy in Lisbon and says, I hate America. I'm an American. I want to fight against America. And at first they're like, yeah, whatever. But then they pack him, they listen to him and they pack him up and they go to the Netherlands, and he spends a few months training as a specialist terrorist to invade America. And they're German, right? So they have original American dollars. They have original American broken in clothes. They really did a thorough job. But the people they chose, not so much. So he goes with a trained spy, this one here, who had worked in Spain on his own, worked in Peru, and they don't like each other. The Americans kind of a passionate, outspoken, indiscreet, and the Germans mind your own business, let me do my job. They go on the boat, the U-boats on the way to France. Some of them had ruined their plans just on the way to France. They talked so loudly that the British considered it a trap. They literally said, they can't be this stupid. And they would leave their stuff and all this stuff. They made it on the boat. They pretended to be workers, which everyone knew they must not be. And the Germans didn't like having these folks because they needed special treatment. They were mentally unhinged, and they couldn't do anything offensive until they got to America. One of them did blow up a ship in the Gulf of Maine and immediately was sunk by Le Tigre. Same with mines. They couldn't shoot anything until the mines were laid. So finally, on the night of November 1st, November 29th, they stop in Bay of Fundy. Then Hilbig, the captain of the submarine, U-230, I think, is very thorough. So he anchors between Yarmouth and Mount Desert, and he makes sure everything's working, right? And he's going to Mount Hancock Point, Maine, which is, I guess, east of I've been there. You all know where Hancock, near Frenchman's Bay, right? So east of Mount Desert. So the guy is so precise that at 11 p.m. on the 29th of November, he hits Baker's Island lights. He hits the chain, the buoy, and it scrapes down the hull of the sub. And they're all going, when's it going to hit the rudder? When's it going to hit the prop? But it doesn't. And they make it. And I have a couple notes here. Great Duck Island, if that means anything. Baker Island. So sure enough, now everyone else has taken many hours to put the men ashore and and there's all kinds of drama. Dogs are barking. The men wanted to be the ones to row them off the U-boat because they were all dead men walking. So they wanted to be the last guy to touch a dead guy. I mean, they're teenagers, right? So they do it. They effectively, in 15 minutes, boom, insert and they left all their telegraphic spying material on the sub. They never intended to really do anything nasty. They just wanted to go to America, and they had $500,000 in cash. So that's what they did. They got landed. The boats come back, and Hilbig retrieves the dinghy, and they go and they sink the Cornwallis of Mount Desert, of which there are 13 survivors and about 30 killed from the guy that didn't want to sink the. So that ends that story, which is the insertion. What happens next? And I retrace these steps. They start walking to Route 1. As they emerge from Route 1 and start going west, Mrs. Mary Forney, whose husband is the tax collector for Hancock, or whichever, the Ellsworth, anyway, right there. And so she sees these men, and she's coming back from her friend Betty's bridge tournament, and it's like 10:30 at night. And so she goes home and she tells her husband, the tax accountant, I saw these strange men. And she said, what's strange? He said, what's so strange about seeing two men on the road? She said, well, the footprints come from the lumber trip. So what the hell were they doing? Excuse my language. What were they doing at the lumber trip? Then she said they were wearing fedoras. He said they were wearing patent leather shoes. They were wearing suitcases with brass buckles. They're a very observant witness. And she said, and she specifically said, he said, well, so what? He said, those are not down east characteristics. That's her language. Those are Wall Street characteristics. And that's absolutely correct. Because this guy had been a waiter on West 44th near the New York outlet. They were going to New York. They were going to Grand Central. And that's what they did. And they spent a month trying to blow up America because nobody took the women seriously. A young guy named Harvard, and it's the second woman because the first was Louise Temple. The other guy's name was Harvard Hodgkins. He was a 20-year-old, and his father was the sheriff. And he told his dad, I've seen these two men, and you know, what are they doing here? They're clearly not locals. They're like bad guys. I've seen two crooks, and you're the sheriff. Can't you stop them? And the dad says, well, you know, and the next day, the women were doing laundry, and they spoke to each other, Harvard's mother and the sheriff's wife. And they're like, so you saw those creeps too? Yeah. So then they got angry with the sheriff. They said, well, do something about it. So what does he do? He goes and looks at 42 rich people's homes. I forget the exact number, and doesn't find anything. So he calls the FBI and says, well, I have a report. And they weren't here breaking a house. They said, yeah. They sank a ship last night. We would have much preferred if you had called us at 10:30 p.m., right? Before the submarine sank a ship. So we actually had a chance to do something. In the meanwhile, these men, Kolpa and the other fellow, they had pushed some U.S. Army recruits out of a taxi, got into the taxi and went to Augusta, which I understand is quite close here. In Augusta, they got on the train, the first Sunrise train to Boston via Portland. I think they took a bus to Portland, and then they took the train to Boston, and then they had to kill a few hours. So they went to a clothier, right? A tailor. And wouldn't you know it, but who should be the tailor? Not only a German tailor, an older man, but he was Jewish. And he noticed from looking at their clothing and his own intuition and knowledge that this clothing was both of German manufacture and also recent, more recent than we had been at war. So he said, you have to be German Nazi spies. How else would you have German clothing that's 2 months old and we've been fighting for 6 months? And they pushed him on the ground and overwhelmed him physically and ran on the train and got away. And they went into New York City, and they were only captured, and gets crazier, because this guy finds a classmate, right, in Manhattan while blowing tons of money. He was basically playing Russian roulette. You can imagine the trouble he got into. He had a lot of money, gambling dens, drugs and alcohol, and sex. And so he meets his buddy, and the buddy takes him home. And now he feels soft and warm towards America and wants to save America from Nazi terrorists, right? You can't make it up. So he turns himself in. But of course, yeah, and then his friend turns out to be gay, so now they're going to like male brothels and female. It gets kind of crazy. And what happens then is he calls the FBI, and they say, you can't be serious. He's like, no, come and interview us. Like, no, we have better things to do than a guy who's chasing skirt around Manhattan saying he's a Nazi spy. And eventually, especially one discredit, they interviewed him, and they sent him right to die. But they sent him to Governor's Island, and then what happens? FDR dies. So it was commuted. Right. So so he goes to a penitentiary in Pennsylvania, where being a somewhat whatever, he becomes an expert at making furniture in prison. And when he gets out of prison, right, he starts a furniture store. And how does that go? It goes really well. He becomes a Rotarian. He becomes the senior Rotarian of Western Pennsylvania and a respected figure, and like gets an award for being a good Rotarian. He can make a lot of money with a lot of furniture, and he retires to Florida. And only then does his Italian American buddy figure it out. Like, you're that Nazi. And he died exposed as a Nazi. This guy went back to Germany. And what they would do in Germany is the survivors would write one book about what heroes there are, and then the other survivor would write a book about what a jerk the other one was, because he turned them all in, and then they would fall silent. But you can't make it up. And what I love about it is Harvard Hodgkins, he won a Boy Scout prize. And all the people like failed to catch the Nazis, like they all got prizes. Somehow, I love Fiorello LaGuardia called FDR. He said, shouldn't we like expose what's happening to the coast and all this dangers, and we should like talk about it more? And FDR said, if you do that, I'm considering opening camps not just for the Japanese Americans, but for the Italian Americans. That's allegedly a conversation that took place between FDR and Fiorello LaGuardia. And they called it the Battle of Washington. The Navy guys were so busy like blaming each other for the sinking of the Normandy and Operation, they weren't paying attention, and they, by their own admission, they stacked all these ports with a bunch of flag officers. I've never had the privilege of serving in any military, but a lot of sort of higher than operational level decision makers that countermanded the people that were trying to do the job on the ground. And it just didn't. And also, if you ever look at the naval grids of who was responsible for what, it was, I wouldn't even print it here. It was so impossible to decipher. So if you mow 1 mile south, it goes into a different territory. So these guys on the left, this is actually a great heroic moment in the US Navy. Okay, got 2 or 3 more minutes. These guys, 5 minutes earlier, were in that. So this happened off Newport. Pennsylvania was Massachusetts, one of the, I think it's Pennsylvania, largest tanker ever built. It was on its maiden voyage in America. And it was just being sent from Philadelphia over to Europe to save Europe from Nazi invasion. The submarine hid under, the submarine hit the tanker with a torpedo, and it was in an escort of a very thick convoy. The Americans were very angry because this is right off Nantucket. So the counterattack, well, the sub hid under the tanker, which was huge. And so they blew up the tanker. And they tried to get at this sub, and they eventually forced it to the surface. As you can see, all 44 men, it is statistically known because they've dived on it, Eric Wiberg and others, and they've written a book about this, but it's statistically known that all men survived. But a very heroic, I think, and I don't use that word very often, the commander of one of the destroyers said, we're not going to watch them die, and we have to go back to the convoy, and there's not much point shooting it anymore. So what he did was without any authority, he went alongside the sub. And his last transmission was a little emotional. He said, if they shoot me, shoot us all. That was his instruction. And he went alongside and he grabbed these guys. And one of them was the commander, Hanser. And then he left and they went to Europe. All those men died. And they died slow deaths in the water. And that's war, And I found where a lot of them were buried. And a lot of them were picked up by Harvard people who called them malodorous cadavers, and the papers went one place. I brought people to see the graves. It's quite an interesting story. But that's a typical story. I thought it was tremendous bravery that they rescued those men. So these guys are just they know that they should be dead. But here they are going to Dublin, Ireland, So these are a story that you probably never heard. These were captured. They were surrendered by Italian and French and used as decoys. You don't hear a lot of subs. Our sub sinking other people. Like our subs didn't sink their subs in New England ever until after the war. But after the war, these German subs all surrendered. And you could write, and that's Italian and there's French, and they could not be in the same port at the same time. I think Kittery had, and Portsmouth, Maine, and New London, because they hated each other so much. The French in particular, because the Italians waited until the Germans had basically conquered France, and then they're like, we're with the Germans. So the French, any opportunity to kill or insult an Italian, they would take it. And of course, the dockyard workers in America were like, what are we all supposed to be allies here? Because they were manned by Italian and French. This is us taking over the subs in mostly New Hampshire, but some right on the border of Maine. This one, he has a Berlusconi, or he had an Italian name, and these, and we'll close out the essay. Notice the long hair. About 20 submarines were sent to America, and only about 5 or 6 made it. And this guy, Steinhoff, he died in a prison of suicide. And as you know, that prison was a holding cell for the courts in Boston. So you go across the street, you get the Mass General. So he cut his own wrists in a common jail after being insulted, using either a watch or glasses, and the doctor couldn't save him. So he died on the gurney in Mass General because they couldn't get to him on time. The road is about 30 feet wide between the hospital and jail. This is now the Liberty Hotel. So you can go figure that one out. But one of the Marines had been given free rein to knock him unconscious when he was handcuffed to a chair. So he wasn't a very happy guy. He's buried in, and I looked it up. I don't think the Geneva Conventions were in place at the time. So it's like, it was very murky. But Admiral King, the head of the Navy, whose own daughter said he was the most flinty person in the world, he was constantly in a state of rage. He had a huge investigation. He was not pleased that because Steinhoff's brother became a national American hero. He became the inventor of the atomic bomb, a co-inventor. Steinhoff, Friedrich Steinhoff's brother, he won the Medal of Honor or something in the United States. So, and this guy was smuggling weapons over to Japan, so he could have been useful. So it was a mistake. If you look, you'll find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 German submarines sunk off P-TAP. So there they are. And here's pictures of them being sunk. These are the details. Here, there they are. So we took practice shots. And I'll close out on this. The post-war, so this set up the Cold War. But this is a fascinating picture. This is one of the New England boats that had attacked New England that altered course to Argentina. And that's where they're arriving in Argentina. 2 of them, see, 2 boats. That's, it says the number there, 530. But what's interesting, people think like the Nuremberg trials, everyone wanted to drag the war on. For the most part, they didn't. They wanted to find closure and blow things up and be done with it. We captured subs that were wrapped in rubber. We captured subs we knew nothing about, like the engine systems, the power systems, we still don't. We sold subs to like weird scrapping companies in Puerto Rico and Manhattan, and we sank one in DC and then raised it for the SEALs and then sank it again. It's been sunk like 30 times. So a lot of weird, mysterious CIA type stuff happened after the war. But for the most part, the rule was if you captured it, you sink it within a year. So they just dragged them out from New London. They didn't work. They'd all been salvaged and salvaged. And all the parts are missing, and they just took them off P-Town. And I wrote a friend of mine who's in NOAA. I said, why are they sunk? Why are they sunk here? And he said, Eric, it's too deep and dangerous and dark for amateurs to meddle with. It's somewhere we could put them where it's out of the way, and we never want to hear from them again. So I will take questions.